Deep in the archives of Alabama's historical collections lies a series of documents that few have examined in their entirety. Correspondence between county officials, medical records from a sanatorium long since demolished, and court transcripts sealed for decades, all bearing witness to a family whose influence and brutality surpassed that of even the most notorious criminal organizations of American history. The year was 1902, and in the sweltering heat of Alabama's Black Belt region, the Whitehall family had established a reign of terror so methodical and far-reaching that their name was whispered only in the most private of conversations. What differentiates the Whitehalls from other criminal enterprises of the early 20th century was not merely the scope of their operations, but the clinical precision with which they executed their will upon the countryside. Their story begins not with a gunshot or proclamation, but with a single document, a deed of sale for a modest cotton plantation that would become the foundation of an empire built on calculated violence and institutional manipulation. In 1874, when federal troops withdrew from Alabama following Reconstruction, a vacuum of authority emerged in the rural counties. Into this void stepped Josiah Whitehall, a former Confederate surgeon whose medical knowledge would later serve purposes far removed from healing. The Whitehall Plantation House still stands today, though its current owners are unaware of the architectural modifications made to accommodate the family's specialized operations. Concealed chambers beneath the dining room where financial ledgers were kept, modified root cellars with unusual drainage systems, and specially insulated walls in the east wing where, according to county records, consultations with uncooperative business associates were conducted. What makes the Whitehall case study particularly disturbing to researchers of criminal history is the family's methodical documentation of their activities, a practice usually avoided by organized crime. Josiah Whitehall, with his medical background, approached criminal enterprise with scientific detachment, recording transactions, territorial expansions, and punitive measures with the same clinical precision he once applied to battlefield amputations. This documentary evidence, discovered in 1967 during renovation of the county courthouse, reveals an operation that makes contemporaries like the early Sicilian Mafia appear disorganized and reactive by comparison. The origins of Josiah Whitehall himself remain somewhat obscured by conflicting records. According to military documents, he served as a field surgeon in the 4th Alabama Infantry Regiment during the Civil War, where he developed a reputation for performing complex procedures under adverse conditions. What these official records fail to mention, however, are the unofficial experiments conducted in field hospitals during the final desperate months of the conflict. A journal kept by a Union medical officer who examined Confederate field hospitals after the surrender references, finding unusual surgical modifications in several deceased soldiers, treated by a surgeon matching Whitehall's description. Procedures that served no apparent medical purpose, but demonstrated intimate knowledge of neurological systems. This same Union physician noted that certain battlefield amputations performed by this surgeon showed evidence of experimental nerve severance techniques that went beyond standard medical practice of the era. These early indications of Whitehall's willingness to use medical knowledge for purposes beyond healing foreshadowed the methodologies that would later characterize his criminal enterprise. His transition from military surgeon to landowner after the war appeared unremarkable on the surface, one of many former Confederate officers establishing himself in the post-war economy. Yet the precision with which he selected his initial land purchase, a modest property situated at the convergence of 3 county transportation routes, suggests a strategic vision that extended far beyond agricultural pursuits. The Whitehall family operated through a 3-tiered system of influence. The first tier consisted of legitimate businesses, cotton production, a freight company, and eventually 3 banks across Sumter and Marengo counties. The second tier comprised compromised institutional figures, a probate judge, 2 sheriffs, and a state representative. But it was the third tier that distinguished the Whitehalls from typical criminal organizations, a network of medical professionals who provided services ranging from discreet treatment of injuries to certification of deaths that required no further investigation. Dr. Elias Mercer, the county coroner from 1897 to 1904, appears in Whitehall's ledgers as receiving monthly payments of $75, approximately $2.400 in today's currency, for what was listed only as professional courtesy. During Mercer's tenure, not a single death connected to Whitehall business interests was ruled as homicide, despite evidence in private correspondence that at least 17 individuals met violent ends after opposing family operations. Most disturbing, however, was the family's approach to discipline within their own ranks. While other criminal organizations relied on intimidation and violence to maintain loyalty, the Whitehalls employed something far more insidious: psychological reconditioning through medical means. The process of establishing this three-tiered system began almost immediately upon Whitehall's acquisition of the plantation. Within 6 months of his purchase, county records indicate that the local freight company experienced a series of mysterious equipment failures, forcing its owner into debt. Whitehall, through a series of intermediaries, provided financial assistance that gradually transferred ownership to his control. This pattern, the systematic creation of crises, followed by apparently benevolent intervention, became a signature of early Whitehall expansion. What distinguished their approach from simple predatory business practices was the meticulous tailoring of each crisis to the specific vulnerability of the target. For the freight company, it was equipment failure. For a competing cotton broker, it was unexplained fires in storage facilities. For a local merchant who refused to extend credit to Whitehall associates, it was a sudden outbreak of typhoid in his household that resolved only after business arrangements were established. The common element in each case was that the resolution of these crises invariably led to Whitehall control of the affected business, either directly or through proxies. By 1880, barely 6 years after his arrival in the region, Josiah Whitehall had established control over transportation, agricultural processing, and mercantile credit across a significant portion of Sumter County. Each acquisition expanded not merely his economic power but his access to information and institutional leverage that would enable subsequent expansion. The east wing of the Whitehall plantation housed what family documents referred to as the consultation room. Correspondence between Josiah and his eldest son, Augustus, references the room's specialized equipment, including an early form of electroshock apparatus acquired from a psychiatric hospital in Philadelphia. Local physician records indicate that at least 9 individuals associated with Whitehall operations were admitted to Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa between 1896 and 1902. With symptoms consistent with what modern psychiatry would recognize as induced dissociative disorders. These individuals, upon release, invariably returned to Whitehall employment, exhibiting what contemporary accounts described as unnatural compliance and absence of former personality. The family's medical approach to criminal enterprise extended beyond psychological manipulation to the methodical elimination of opposition. Unlike the demonstrative violence favored by urban gangs of the period, Whitehall orchestrated removals were designed to appear as natural deaths or accidents. County death records from the period show a statistically improbable number of cerebrovascular accidents, respiratory failures, and accidental drownings among individuals who had business or territorial disputes with the family. Particularly noteworthy was the case of Samuel Thornton, a prosperous merchant, who in 1891 attempted to establish a competing banking operation in Livingston. According to correspondence recovered from Whitehall family papers, Augustus expressed concern to his father about Thornton's potential to disrupt their financial operations. 3 weeks later, Thornton began experiencing symptoms of what local physicians diagnosed as progressive neurasthenia, increasing weakness, tremors, and eventually partial paralysis. His condition deteriorated over approximately 6 months, leading to his withdrawal from business activities and the abandonment of the banking venture. Medical records from Thornton's treatment, preserved in county archives, describe symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning, though toxicology tests of the period revealed nothing unusual. A Whitehall ledger entry from this period records a payment to a local pharmacist for specialized mineral preparations, followed by 6 monthly payments to one of Thornton's household staff. Most disturbing was a notation in Josiah Whitehall's personal journal, dated 2 weeks before Thornton's first symptoms appeared, that reads, "Commenced Thornton Protocol. Estimated resolution, 180 to 200 days. The precision of this prediction compared to the actual course of Thornton's illness, which resulted in his death 191 days after the journal entry, demonstrates the clinical methodology underlying Whitehall operations. Perhaps most chilling was the family's use of their medical knowledge to develop substances that left no trace in post-mortem examinations of the period. Josiah Whitehall's personal journal, discovered in 1973 in a hidden compartment of his writing desk, contains detailed formulations for compounds derived from native botanicals that could induce symptoms mimicking natural pathologies. One entry, dated March 1899, describes a preparation from water hemlock and another unidentified substance that could produce a gradual deterioration indistinguishable from natural decline, culminating in cardiac failure within 30 days of initial administration. The journal references testing these formulations, though the subjects are identified only by initials. Cross-referencing with county death records reveals that all individuals matching these initials died of seemingly natural causes within the time frames indicated in Whitehall's notes. This methodical scientific approach to elimination made conventional investigation nearly impossible, particularly given the family's influence over local medical authorities. What distinguishes the Whitehall operation from other historical criminal enterprises was not just their brutality, but their patient, methodical approach to territorial expansion. The sophistication of Josiah Whitehall's pharmaceutical knowledge extended far beyond what would be expected of a battlefield surgeon. Analysis of his journal by modern toxicologists suggests an understanding of botanical compounds that approach the cutting edge of 19th-century pharmacology. One particularly disturbing formulation described in detail was derived from a combination of foxglove, certain mushroom species, and a plant identified only as, quote, the Carolina specimen. According to Whitehall's notes, this combination produced symptoms that precisely mimicked progressive heart failure over a period of weeks, with the advantage that post-mortem examination reveals only the expected pathology of natural cardiac decline. The journal contains dosage calculations based on body weight, detailed observations of onset timing, and methodical refinements to the formula over multiple applications. In one entry, Whitehall notes, Subject C exhibited accelerated response, transition from stage 1 to stage 2 occurring at 9 days rather than the expected 14. Reduction of primary component by 15% indicated for subjects of similar constitution. This level of precise observation and adjustment demonstrates an approach to elimination that had more in common with clinical trials than with traditional criminal violence. The journal also references comparative studies between different formulations, noting specific advantages of certain compounds for particular situations, some for rapid effect, others for symptoms that could be attributed to pre-existing conditions, still others designed specifically to overcome the suspicions of more medically knowledgeable observers. While urban criminal organizations fought for street corners and neighborhoods, the Whitehalls systematically acquired control of entire economic sectors across multiple counties. The family understood that true power in rural Alabama resided not in fast violence but in gradual economic strangulation. Through their legitimate banking operations, the Whitehalls gained access to financial information about every significant business in their territory. Those who resisted direct acquisition would find their loans suddenly called in, their credit restricted, or their suppliers mysteriously unwilling to fulfill orders. A letter from Augustus Whitehall to a lumber mill owner in 1901 demonstrates their approach. Your reluctance to discuss our proposed arrangement is understandable, yet perhaps reconsideration is warranted. I've observed your daughter's respiratory complaints have worsened this season. My father's medical background might prove beneficial, as certain environmental factors can exacerbate such conditions. Within 3 weeks, the lumber mill had been sold to a Whitehall intermediary at approximately 40% of its market value. The daughter made a full recovery shortly thereafter. This pattern of leveraging personal vulnerabilities rather than direct threats appears throughout Whitehall correspondence, demonstrating a psychological sophistication absent in most criminal operations of the era. The family's banking operations deserve particular attention as they represent a significant innovation in criminal methodology for the period. Unlike contemporary urban criminal organizations that focused on extortion, protection rackets, or illicit goods, the Whitehalls recognized that control of legitimate financial infrastructure provided far more extensive power. Their first banking acquisition, the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Livingston, occurred in 1883 through a combination of strategic loan purchases and pressure on existing board members. Once established in the banking sector, they utilized their position to access detailed financial information about every significant business operation in their territory. This intelligence allowed them to identify vulnerabilities with surgical precision, businesses with seasonal cash flow challenges, landowners with inheritance disputes, merchants with inventory management problems. In each case, the family would first engineer a financial crisis through their network of influences, perhaps a key supplier suddenly demanding immediate payment, or a critical shipment mysteriously delayed, and then appear as financial saviors, offering precisely structured assistance that invariably resulted in transfer of control. The banking operations also provided perfect cover for money movement, allowing the integration of funds from their less legitimate operations into documented financial flows. County records indicate that between 1883 and 1900, Whitehall-controlled banks expanded their assets by approximately 340%, a growth rate far exceeding regional economic development, suggesting substantial infusion of funds from undocumented sources. The family's territorial expansion accelerated dramatically after 1898, when Josiah's second son, Thaddeus Whitehall, returned from medical studies at Johns Hopkins University. Unlike his father, whose medical knowledge derived from battlefield experience, Thaddeus brought formal training in the emerging field of bacteriology. Within months of his return, a mysterious livestock illness began affecting farms that competed with Whitehall agricultural interests. The infection, which caused rapid deterioration but left no recognizable lesions upon examination, devastated competing operations while mysteriously sparing Whitehall-affiliated farms. County agricultural records from 1899 show that 7 independent cotton producers who had rejected Whitehall purchase offers lost between 60 to 80% of their draft animals within a single season. All subsequently sold their land to Whitehall representatives at significantly reduced prices. Laboratory techniques of the period were insufficient to identify the pathogen responsible, though modern analysis of preserved specimens suggests a modified form of anthrax with an unusually short bacterial life cycle that would have made it undetectable after causing initial infection. The family's scientific approach to elimination extended beyond competitors to those within the legal system who could not be compromised through conventional means. Thaddeus Whitehall's contribution to the family operation represents a generational evolution in their methodology, from his father's pharmaceutical approach to a more sophisticated biological strategy. His education at Johns Hopkins, one of the preeminent medical research institutions of the period, had exposed him to cutting-edge bacteriological techniques being developed in European laboratories. What makes Thaddeus particularly notable in the context of criminal history is his apparent ability to selectively modify pathogens for specific purposes, a scientific capability that would not become widely understood until decades later. A laboratory journal recovered from a hidden compartment in the plantation house details experiments with what he termed targeted cultivation, procedures that appeared designed to enhance certain pathogenic characteristics while limiting others. One entry references successful development of a livestock pathogen that maintained high virulence but exhibited, quote, containment within specified boundary conditions when environmental markers are present. In practical terms, this appears to describe the ability to ensure that disease outbreaks affected only targeted properties while sparing others, a level of biological control that would have seemed almost supernatural to contemporary observers. The journal also contains detailed vaccination protocols apparently administered to Whitehall livestock before the introduction of these pathogens, ensuring their animals remained unaffected while competitors' herds were devastated. Judge William Hargrove, who presided over the Sumter County Circuit Court from 1895 to 1900, represented a significant obstacle to Whitehall operations due to his reputation for incorruptibility. County records indicate that 3 separate Whitehall associates faced trial under Hargrove, with 2 receiving unusually harsh sentences. In December 1900, Hargrove began experiencing symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, hair loss, progressive weakness, and gastrointestinal distress. Yet toxicology tests, performed by a physician with no known Whitehall connections, revealed no poison. Hargrove died in February 1901, his death attributed to natural causes. His successor immediately reduced the sentences of both imprisoned Whitehall associates. What modern medical analysis suggests, based on Thaddeus Whitehall's research notes, is that the family had developed a method of arsenic administration that converted the element to a form undetectable by period testing, but equally lethal in its physiological effects. This methodical elimination of institutional opposition allowed the Whitehalls to establish what essentially functioned as a parallel government across 2 counties, with economic, legal, and even medical authority concentrated within their sphere of influence. The case of Judge Hargrove represents perhaps the most sophisticated application of the Whitehalls' medical methodology to institutional obstruction. Correspondence between Thaddeus and Augustus Whitehall in November 1900 references a, quote, judicial difficulty that required specialized attention rather than conventional approaches. Thaddeus's laboratory journal from this period contains entries detailing experiments with various arsenic compounds, with particular focus on organic arsenic preparations that metabolize differently in the human body compared to inorganic arsenic typically detected in toxicology screenings of the era. One entry notes success with what he describes as binding the element to specific protein carriers that facilitate cellular uptake while altering detection profiles. Modern toxicology suggests this likely refers to an early form of what would later be recognized as organic arsenic compounds, which produce identical physiological effects to inorganic arsenic, but require different chemical tests for detection. A ledger entry dated 3 weeks before Hargrove's first symptoms notes payment to a staff member in the judge's household, followed by a notation: initial preparation delivered to subject environment, estimated progression, 60 to 80 days. Hargrove's death occurred 71 days after this entry. Most disturbing is the methodical observation documented in Thaddeus's journal throughout Hargrove's decline, with entries cataloging symptoms, progression rate, and effectiveness of the approach, concluding with an entry on the day of Hargrove's death that reads simply, "Protocol complete. Results exceed expectations. Methodology approved for future institutional obstacles of similar nature." By 1902, at the height of their power, the Whitehalls controlled approximately 60% of the arable land in Sumter County and had significant holdings in 3 adjacent counties. Their banking operations had expanded to include financial institutions in Birmingham, giving them influence that extended beyond their rural base into Alabama's industrial center. What makes this period particularly significant is the family's transition from reactive to proactive operations. Rather than merely responding to opposition, they began systematically identifying and neutralizing potential threats before any actual resistance could materialize. Parish records from St. Michael's Episcopal Church, where many county elites worshipped, indicate that Augustus Whitehall made substantial donations to fund a major renovation in 1901. What remained undocumented until the discovery of family correspondence was that this renovation included the installation of an advanced acoustical design in the church vestry, where the parish council, comprising many of the region's influential citizens, held their meetings. The modification, based on principles of parabolic reflection, allowed conversations to be clearly heard through a concealed listening post in an adjacent maintenance room. This sophisticated surveillance operation gave the Whitehalls unprecedented intelligence about business plans, political alignments, and even personal vulnerabilities among the county's leadership. The acoustical modifications to St. Michael's Episcopal Church represent a particularly innovative approach to intelligence gathering for the period. Architectural plans recovered from Whitehall papers indicate that Augustus had consulted with an acoustical engineer from Boston, ostensibly for improvements to the church's musical qualities. The actual modifications, however, created what the engineer's notes describe as exceptional sound transference properties between the vestry and an adjoining storage room. The design incorporated early principles of acoustic channeling, with specific wall sections constructed to function essentially as primitive audio waveguides. The modifications were disguised as decorative architectural elements, wooden paneling with intricate carvings that concealed their actual purpose. Church financial records show that Augustus personally funded these aesthetic improvements through a donation of approximately $1,200, a substantial sum equivalent to nearly $40,000 in modern currency. The listening post in the storage room was disguised as a maintenance area, but contained a chair positioned at the optimal point for sound reception, and what parish records describe as a small writing desk for inventory management. Whitehall ledgers indicate that a church custodian received regular payments for what was listed as, quote, property maintenance, though correspondence suggests his actual role was to monitor conversations and provide written reports. This systematic intelligence operation provided the family with detailed information about business ventures, personal problems, and political maneuvers long before they became public knowledge, allowing them to position themselves advantageously in virtually every significant economic and political development in the region. In addition to their extensive surveillance networks, the Whitehalls employed what contemporary law enforcement would recognize as an early form of strategic intelligence analysis. Recovered documents include what Augustus Whitehall termed influence maps, detailed diagrams showing relationships between key figures in the region, with annotations regarding personal vulnerabilities, financial exposures, and specific pressure points that could be exploited if necessary. These maps were updated regularly, with entries often including intimate details about health issues, marital problems, hidden vices, and financial difficulties that could serve as leverage. One particularly comprehensive map from early 1902 includes annotations on 47 key figures across 4 counties, with color coding indicating their degree of cooperation with Whitehall interests. Individuals marked in red, indicating active opposition, numbered only 3 by this point, suggesting the effectiveness of their systematic approach to neutralizing resistance. Perhaps most disturbing was the methodical tracking of potential future threats, promising young attorneys, ambitious bank clerks, or merchants, sons returning from education in the North, all categorized according to their potential to eventually challenge Whitehall interests and assigned what family documents referred to as integration protocols, designed to either incorporate them into the family's sphere of influence or neutralize their potential before it could develop. The family's operations reached their zenith in mid-1902, when their influence extended to approximately 42 distinct businesses across 4 counties, with estimated annual revenues equivalent to approximately $30 million in modern currency. Yet this expansion contained the seeds of their eventual downfall. As their operations grew beyond the scope that could be personally overseen by family members, they necessarily incorporated an increasing number of associates who lacked the Whitehalls' methodical discipline. One such associate, James Harrington, managed Whitehall timber interests in northwestern Sumter County. Correspondence indicates that Harrington was considered troublesome by Augustus due to his excessive displays of temper and indiscreet communications. In September 1902, Harrington became involved in a public altercation with a representative of a northern lumber concern that had begun operations in the region. The altercation escalated to violence, resulting in the representative's death, but unlike the careful, untraceable eliminations characteristic of Whitehall operations, this occurred in full view of witnesses at a county agricultural fair. More significantly, the victim's connection to northern financial interests brought unprecedented scrutiny to the region. Harrington's actions represented precisely the type of undisciplined violence that the Whitehalls had systematically avoided throughout their operations. Witness accounts of the incident, preserved in county court records, describe Harrington publicly accusing the Northern Lumber representative of attempting to, quote, undermine established business arrangements before striking him with a walking stick with such force that it caused a fatal cerebral hemorrhage. What made this incident particularly damaging was not merely its public nature, but the victim's connections. The representative, Edward Caldwell, was employed by a timber consortium with direct financial ties to several prominent New York banking houses. His death immediately triggered inquiries from financial interests far beyond the Whitehall's sphere of influence. Family correspondence in the weeks following the incident reveals their recognition of the potential threat, with Augustus writing to his father, "Harrington's impulsiveness has created exposure that our established protocols cannot address. External interest exceeds our institutional capacity to redirect." This clinical assessment of their strategic position demonstrates the analytical approach that characterized their operations even in crisis. A recognition that their carefully constructed system of local influence would be insufficient against the financial and political power that Caldwell's death had now focused on their territory. The Whitehalls immediately implemented containment measures, with Harrington himself found dead of apparent suicide 3 days after the incident, though family ledgers record a payment to 2 regular enforcers on the same date. Within days of the incident, Pinkerton detectives arrived in Sumter County, ostensibly to investigate the representative's death, but with broader authority to examine the business climate that had led to the confrontation. The Whitehalls' carefully constructed shield of medical, legal, and financial influence proved insufficient against investigators who operated outside local jurisdictional constraints and answered to northern industrial concerns rather than local authorities. The Pinkerton investigation began with Harrington, but quickly expanded as inconsistencies in county records and suspicious patterns of land acquisition drew their attention. Most damaging was their focus on the statistically improbable mortality rate among business owners who had opposed Whitehall interests. Though the family's medical methodology had defeated local examination, the Pinkertons employed a toxicologist from Johns Hopkins University, ironically, from the same institution where Thaddeus Whitehall had studied. This specialist identified trace evidence of unusual compounds in exhumed remains that local examinations had missed. The investigation accelerated in November 1902 when a disgruntled former Whitehall employee provided information about modified structures within the plantation house, leading to the discovery of the family's detailed records of their operations. The Pinkerton operation against the Whitehalls represented one of the most sophisticated corporate security investigations of the early 20th century. Led by senior operative Michael Callahan, whose previous work had included infiltrating labor organizations and investigating industrial sabotage, the team employed what internal Pinkerton reports described as comprehensive environmental assessment, a methodical examination not merely of the specific incident, but of the entire economic and political context in which it occurred. Unlike local law enforcement, constrained by jurisdictional limitations and vulnerable to institutional pressure, the Pinkerton detectives operated with the full financial backing of northern industrial interests concerned about the security of their southern investments. Their investigation employed multiple operatives in different roles, some posing as agricultural investors, others as traveling salesmen, still others as labor recruiters, all gathering different perspectives on the region's power structures. The breakthrough came when they identified statistical anomalies in county death records, specifically the disproportionate number of business owners who had died of apparently natural causes shortly after business disputes with Whitehall interests. This pattern, unremarkable to local authorities accustomed to the family's influence, immediately triggered suspicion among investigators trained to recognize systematic elimination. The exhumation of 3 such individuals, performed under federal authority that bypassed local approval processes, provided the physical evidence that connected these deaths to the specialized compounds documented in Whitehall medical journals. This evidence, combined with financial records showing the systematic transfer of assets from deceased business owners to Whitehall-controlled entities, established a pattern of criminal activity that justified federal intervention. On December 3, 1902, federal marshals and Pinkerton detectives surrounded the Whitehall plantation. What followed has been pieced together from multiple accounts, though the official report remains surprisingly sparse in its details. According to correspondence between Pinkerton operatives, the marshals announced their intention to arrest family members on multiple charges, including fraud, racketeering, and murder. After initial verbal exchanges, gunfire erupted from the house, initiating a standoff that lasted approximately 4 hours. At 2:17 p.m., witnesses reported multiple gunshots from within the structure, followed by silence. When authorities finally entered the plantation house, they discovered a scene that one marshal's private correspondence described as methodical, even in its finality. Josiah, Augustus, and Thaddeus Whitehall were found in the main study, each having suffered a single, precisely placed gunshot wound to the temple. Forensic evidence indicated that Josiah had first shot his sons before turning the weapon on himself. The precision of the wounds was consistent with his surgical background, displaying the same clinical detachment in death that had characterized their criminal operations in life. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the family had apparently anticipated this outcome well in advance. The final confrontation at the Whitehall plantation reveals the family's contingency planning extended even to their own elimination. The positions of the bodies, as documented in law enforcement photographs, showed a deliberate arrangement. Josiah seated at his desk, his sons in chairs positioned at precise angles before him. The marshal's report notes that all 3 men were dressed formally, as though for a business meeting rather than a last stand. Most telling was the document found open on Josiah's desk, not a desperate plea or angry denunciation, but a methodical inventory of family assets with detailed distribution instructions in the event of their deaths. This document, dated 3 months before the raid, included provisions for the financial maintenance of key associates, arrangements for the continuation of legitimate business operations, and even instructions for the disposal of specialized equipment and documentation. The scene, as described by one Pinkerton detective in private correspondence, appeared not as the chaotic end of a criminal enterprise, but as the conclusion of a carefully documented medical procedure. This final act of controlled self-elimination, planned and executed with the same precision that characterized all their operations, represented the ultimate expression of the clinical approach that distinguished the Whitehalls from conventional criminal organizations of their era. A sealed letter addressed to the federal marshal dated 3 months prior to the raid was found in Josiah's desk. Its contents acknowledged the probability of their operations being discovered once they expanded beyond certain parameters, and included detailed provisions for the distribution of legitimate family assets. This final communication displayed the same analytical precision evident throughout their criminal enterprise, a calculated assessment of risk, probability, and inevitable conclusion. With the family's elimination, their criminal infrastructure rapidly collapsed. Associates either fled the region or attempted to secure leniency through cooperation with authorities. The scope of the operation was so extensive that the federal investigation continued for nearly 2 years, resulting in the conviction of 27 individuals on charges ranging from fraud to accessory to murder. Yet many aspects of the Whitehall operations remained obscured, particularly those involving their medical methodologies. Thaddeus Whitehall's laboratory, located in a separate structure on the plantation grounds, was destroyed in a fire during the final confrontation, with most of his research notes and experimental records lost. The letter found in Josiah's desk provides perhaps the most revealing insight into the family's conception of their criminal enterprise. Addressed formally to representatives of federal authority, the document begins not with defiance or justification, but with what can only be described as scientific observation. The expansion of our operational methodology beyond its optimal territorial parameters has, as anticipated, triggered systemic responses beyond our capacity for institutional management. This outcome was calculated as a probable scenario in our risk assessment of March this year, with estimated probability of 67% within a 12-month time frame. The letter continues with detailed instructions for the disposition of family assets, particularly emphasizing that certain legitimate operations should continue under specified management to, quote, maintain regional economic stability and prevent collateral economic damage to uninvolved parties. Most chilling, however, is the letter's conclusion, which reads, "We acknowledge the investigative acumen demonstrated in the identification of our methodologies, which have operated without detection by conventional authorities for 28 years, 4 months, and 17 days. The termination of our operational protocols has been implemented according to contingency planning established at the outset of our enterprise. Documentation of methodological innovations has been secured against unauthorized application. This final communication reveals the Whitehalls' conception of their criminal activities not as a desperate grab for power or wealth, but as a long-term experiment in the application of medical and financial expertise to regional control, an experiment they had always recognized might eventually reach its conclusion. In the aftermath of the Whitehall case, significant reforms were implemented in Alabama's banking regulations and county medical examination procedures. The state medical board established new protocols specifically designed to identify unusual toxins in deceased individuals, particularly those whose deaths occurred in contexts of business or land disputes. These reforms, known informally as Whitehall protocols, remained in place until superseded by more advanced forensic standards in the 1940s. Yet, despite these institutional responses, much about the family's operations remained inadequately examined. Their use of medical knowledge for criminal purposes represented a methodological innovation in organized crime that fortunately found few imitators, perhaps due to the specialized knowledge required. The combination of medical expertise, financial acumen, and institutional manipulation demonstrated by the Whitehalls represented a form of criminal enterprise that transcended the territorial violence characteristic of urban gangs, achieving instead a kind of bureaucratic terror that operated through legitimate systems rather than in opposition to them. The regulatory reforms implemented in response to the Whitehall case represent one of the earliest examples of systemic institutional adaptation to sophisticated criminal methodology. Banking regulations established in 1904 specifically required Alabama financial institutions to document and report patterns of asset transfer following deaths of loan recipients or business owners, a direct response to the Whitehalls' practice of acquiring businesses through elimination of their owners, followed by financial pressure on their heirs. Similarly, the state medical board implemented new requirements for county coroners, including mandatory secondary examination in cases where deceased individuals had been involved in recent business or land disputes. Perhaps most significant was the establishment of a state-level review process for deaths occurring among elected or appointed officials, a direct response to the elimination of Judge Hargrove and several other institutional figures who had opposed Whitehall interests. These reforms represented an early recognition that certain forms of criminal enterprise could operate through rather than against legitimate institutions, requiring systematic rather than individual protections. However, the loss of most of Thaddeus Whitehall's research materials in the laboratory fire meant that many of the family's most sophisticated medical methodologies remained inadequately understood, limiting the effectiveness of specific toxicological screenings implemented in response to their operations. What remains particularly disturbing about the Whitehall case is not merely the scope of their operations or their methodical brutality, but the evidence suggesting that their methods may have spread beyond their immediate organization. In 1916, a criminal investigation in Mobile, Alabama, uncovered an operation using similar techniques of medical elimination and financial leverage. 2 individuals connected to this operation had previously worked as administrative staff in Whitehall banking interests. More troubling were reports from federal investigators in 1924 that certain urban criminal organizations in Chicago and Cleveland had adopted methodologies consistent with Whitehall practices, particularly in the use of sophisticated surveillance techniques and the targeted compromise of medical professionals. The Whitehall methodology, the systematic application of medical, financial, and psychological techniques to criminal enterprise, represented an evolutionary development in organized crime that fortunately remained limited in its adoption, perhaps due to the specialized knowledge and unusual discipline required for its implementation. The dissemination of Whitehall methodologies, though limited, represents a disturbing aspect of their legacy. The mobile operation uncovered in 1916 demonstrated several key characteristics consistent with Whitehall approaches. particularly the use of medical professionals to certify convenient causes of death for business competitors and the systematic leveraging of financial infrastructure to identify and exploit vulnerabilities. Federal investigation revealed that two principals in this operation, Robert Mercer and Thomas Lancaster, had served as administrative clerks in the Whitehall-controlled Bank of Livingston between 1898 and 1902. While not directly involved in the family's criminal activities, their positions would have exposed them to the systematic methodology underlying Whitehall operations. The mobile group never achieved the sophisticated integration of medical and financial techniques that characterized the original Whitehall operation, but their attempted replication of the approach suggests the methodological innovations developed by the family had transmission potential beyond their immediate circle. More concerning were indications in Bureau of Investigation reports from the early 1920s that certain aspects of Whitehall methodology had been adapted by more established criminal organizations in northern cities. A 1924 report specifically notes that a Chicago operation had established systematic compromise of medical examination procedures through financial inducement of hospital staff, in a manner consistent with Alabama precedent, an apparent reference to the Whitehall approach to ensuring favorable death determinations. Similarly, a Cleveland criminal organization had reportedly developed surveillance techniques focused on, quote, identification of personal and financial vulnerabilities through institutional access, reflecting the Whitehall practice of using legitimate business positions to gather leverage information. The physical remnants of the Whitehall operation have largely disappeared from the landscape. Their plantation house was purchased by an agricultural corporation in 1922 and subsequently demolished to expand cotton production. The banks they controlled were absorbed into larger financial institutions during the consolidations of the 1930s. Even their family cemetery was relocated during the construction of a county road in 1956. The headstones moved to a municipal graveyard where they stand today, unremarkable except for the precision of their alignment. One final expression of the methodical nature that characterized both their lives and their criminal enterprise. Yet the most enduring aspect of the Whitehall legacy lies not in physical structures, but in the institutional responses their operations provoked. Beyond specific regulatory reforms, their case contributed to a broader recognition of how professional expertise, medical, legal, financial, could be systematically corrupted for criminal purposes. This recognition informed the development of professional ethical frameworks that emphasized institutional responsibility to identify and prevent such corruption. The institutional memory of the Whitehall operation remained active in law enforcement and regulatory contexts long after the physical evidence of their presence had disappeared. A Bureau of Investigation training document from 1927, recently declassified, contains a section specifically addressing what it terms the Alabama methodology, a detailed analysis of how the Whitehalls transformed legitimate professional knowledge into criminal instruments. The document emphasizes the importance of cross-institutional awareness, noting that criminal operations of this nature depend upon compartmentalization of knowledge between medical, financial, and legal authorities, and stressing the importance of information sharing across professional boundaries. Similarly, Alabama state banking examiners continued to receive specific training on identifying patterns of financial activity consistent with Whitehall practices until at least the 1950s. Perhaps most significant was the impact on medical professional ethics in the region. The Alabama Medical Association in 1905 established one of the nation's first formal ethical review boards, specifically focused on identifying potential corruption of medical practice for criminal purposes, a direct response to the role medical professionals had played in facilitating Whitehall operations. This institutional adaptation to the specific threats posed by the Whitehall methodology represents an early recognition that certain forms of criminal enterprise required systemic rather than merely individual responses, that the corruption of professional knowledge for criminal purposes demanded structural protections that extended beyond conventional law enforcement approaches. In the archives of Alabama's historical collections, the Whitehall documents remain available to researchers, though accessing the complete collection requires specific academic credentials and institutional affiliation. These restrictions exist not to suppress historical knowledge but in recognition that the family's methodologies retain a disturbing potential for adaptation, even in the modern context. Their criminal innovation lay not in violence itself, which has always characterized organized crime, but in the clinical systematization of that violence through professional knowledge and institutional leverage. The Whitehalls represented something distinct from the familiar narrative of organized crime in America. Not immigrants fighting for economic foothold, not urban gangs battling for territory, but an indigenous rural operation that transformed medical and financial expertise into instruments of regional domination. Their operation demonstrated that organized crime need not emerge from social marginalization, but could develop within established professional classes, using specialized knowledge as its primary instrument rather than traditional violence. The access restrictions placed on certain Whitehall documents reflect an ongoing recognition of their potential danger. While most of the collection, including financial records, correspondence, and general operational documentation, is available to qualified researchers, specific materials remain subject to limited access. These include Josiah Whitehall's pharmaceutical journals detailing compound formulations, Thaddeus Whitehall's surviving bacteriological research notes, and documents outlining their psychological conditioning methodologies. The restriction protocol, established in 1967 when the documents were first catalogued, requires researchers seeking access to these materials to demonstrate legitimate academic or historical purpose and to agree to specific limitations on publication of certain technical details. These restrictions have occasionally generated controversy among historians, who argue that full access would allow more complete understanding of this historical case. However, medical and law enforcement consultants involved in establishing the protocols have maintained that certain aspects of Whitehall methodology retain potential for modern adaptation that outweighs purely historical interest. This tension between historical documentation and public safety considerations reflects the unusual nature of the Whitehall operation, not merely a criminal enterprise but a systematic exploration of how professional knowledge could be weaponized for regional control. Their approach represented an intersection of criminal intent with scientific methodology that continues to raise questions about the potential dark applications of professional expertise. Perhaps the most significant aspect of the Whitehall case for contemporary analysis of historical criminal enterprises is its illumination of how technical expertise could be weaponized within criminal contexts. While much attention in criminal history focuses on organizations that operated primarily through force, the Whitehalls demonstrated the potential effectiveness of operations conducted through knowledge and institutional manipulation. Their criminal methodology represented a form of systemic corruption that targeted not merely individuals but entire institutional frameworks, medical, legal, financial, rendering these systems instruments of criminal enterprise rather than protections against it. This systematic corruption of professional knowledge for criminal application represented an innovation that transcended traditional concepts of organized crime, achieving a form of regional influence that made conventional mafia operations appear limited and reactive by comparison. The Whitehall family's brief but devastating reign over Alabama's Black Belt region serves as a historical case study in how specialized knowledge, methodical application, and institutional leverage could create a criminal enterprise of unusual effectiveness and durability. The conceptual innovation underlying Whitehall operations remains their most disturbing legacy. While conventional organized crime typically operates through parallel systems that exist alongside legitimate society, alternative economies, protection networks, illicit goods and services, the Whitehalls developed a methodology that parasitized legitimate institutional structures themselves. Their approach did not create parallel systems but corrupted existing ones, transforming them into instruments of criminal enterprise while maintaining their appearance of legitimacy. This methodology required an unusual combination of specialized knowledge, institutional access, and clinical detachment, characteristics more common among professional elites than traditional criminal classes. The implication that criminal enterprise of unusual effectiveness could emerge from within, rather than outside established social structures, represented a troubling expansion of potential threat vectors beyond those typically addressed by law enforcement of the period. The Whitehall case suggested that the most dangerous criminal innovations might come not from marginalized groups fighting for economic territory, but from those with the specialized knowledge and institutional position to identify and exploit systemic vulnerabilities. This insight continues to inform analyses of white-collar crime and institutional corruption in the modern context, where criminal methodologies based on specialized knowledge rather than direct violence often prove particularly challenging to conventional enforcement approaches. The final ledger entry in Josiah Whitehall's personal account book, dated November 30, 1902, 3 days before the federal raid, contains a single line that perhaps best encapsulates the family's approach to their criminal enterprise. Written in the same precise hand that documented their expansion, operations, and eliminations, it reads simply, "The experiment concludes as anticipated. Results consistent with initial hypothesis." This clinical detachment, this conception of criminal enterprise as a form of methodical experimentation rather than emotional violence, distinguished the Whitehalls from their contemporaries and secured their place in the hidden history of American crime. Their operation demonstrated that in the specific historical context of post-reconstruction Alabama, with its particular combination of economic conditions, institutional weaknesses, and rural isolation, a form of criminal enterprise could emerge that made urban organized crime appear unstructured and inefficient by comparison. The Whitehall case stands as a reminder that criminal innovation often emerges not from the margins of society, but from those with the specialized knowledge and social position to identify and exploit systemic vulnerabilities. As Alabama moved into the 20th century, the mechanisms of state governance gradually strengthened, closing many of the institutional gaps that had allowed the Whitehall operation to flourish. Banking regulations, medical oversight, and legal accountability all evolved in ways that would have made their particular methodology increasingly difficult to implement. Yet the fundamental insight of their criminal approach, that specialized professional knowledge could be systematically applied to criminal enterprise, remains relevant to understanding how organized crime continues to evolve and adapt to changing institutional contexts. The Whitehalls were not merely criminals, but innovators in the methodology of organized crime, developing approaches that emphasized patience, precision, and systematic application of specialized knowledge, rather than immediate violence and territorial control. Their legacy lies not in a continuing criminal enterprise. Their organization died with them in that plantation study, but in demonstrating a potential evolutionary path for organized crime that fortunately few organizations have fully realized. The Whitehall case reminds us that the most effective criminal enterprises are not necessarily those that operate with the greatest violence or visibility, but those that systematically identify and exploit the vulnerabilities in legitimate systems. Their operation demonstrated that in the specific conditions of rural Alabama at the turn of the century, a form of organized crime could develop that functioned less as a parallel society, as with urban gangs, and more as a parasitic overlay on existing social structures, corrupting those structures from within rather than challenging them from without. This methodological insight, that criminal enterprise could operate through rather than against legitimate institutions, represents the Whitehalls' disturbing innovation in the evolution of American organized crime. Their brief but devastating control over Alabama's Black Belt region serves as a historical reminder of how specialized knowledge, patient application, and systematic corruption could create a criminal empire that made even the most notorious urban crime families appear disorganized and inefficient by comparison.